Welcome, everybody. My name is Doug Frost. Glad you're here. This is Benchmark Wine Group's Raid Your Cellar tasting, virtual tasting. I guess I should say we're around a virtual table, but you know that's better than no table at all in my world. I'm pretty pleased that that you're here, and pleased that we're getting a chance to do this via the good auspices of benchmarkwine.com, a great source of fine and rare wine that I have certainly availed myself of many times. So here we are again. First off, I want to introduce Diana Kelley, who is here from Mexico City. I'm in Kansas City, so we're, depending upon where you are, we might be far, far away from you, or we might be around around the neighborhood. But Diana manages exports for the Vega Sicilia group in North America. So Diana, welcome. Tell us how things are in Mexico City.
Hello, Doug. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited about doing this tasting, and we really hope you enjoy it. So yeah, we're here, like we were saying just previously, Doug, home like everyone else, I guess. We're making the best out of it with good wine and good company. So yeah, very excited.
That's great. So yeah, but I guess that means you're locked up in Ciudad de Mexico as well.
Yes. I mean, we're allowed. I mean, it's not mandatory lockdown. You can go out, but yeah, it's obviously, well, a lot of things are still closed. Restaurants, like in the U.S., are operating at 30% capacity, and still there's a lot of restrictions for moving around the city. So yeah, and just for safety, we rather just stay home for a little while longer, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, I do think that at some point things will be better, but as you said, things are definitely better because we have wine. As you can see,
Yeah.
I have wine behind me. I do not run out. And those of you who are just now joining us from Facebook Live, welcome in. I'm Doug Frost. This is Diana Kelley, and we are going to drink some wines with you. And if you have any sense whatsoever, you will be drinking wines with us too. I think that stands to reason. That's why you joined us, watching other people drink. I've been there. It's not good. It's not a good thing. It's not fun. So first off, our very first wine that we were going to talk about is indeed a Furmint. And this is from the Tokai region in Hungary. And it's a really fascinating place. It's a fascinating culture. Can I say, first and foremost, Hungary is an ancient culture. It's a language I will never even begin to be able to speak. I mean, I can't even say thank you and goodbye and hello and say numbers in it. It makes me insane. But the wines themselves are really quite fascinating. Most of us know Tokai as a dessert wine, but thankfully, increasingly, we're seeing dry ferments in the North American market. Oremos, as probably some of you know, certainly is one of the most famous, and I think one of the most highly regarded of estates there. And Oremos once upon a time was the name of a grape as well. We now call the grape Zeta, but it is, if you recall those days when it was Oremos, growing Oremos, that's why. But these things do get sorted out. You remember I said something about the language, Hungarian, how it's a little confusing at times? Just one small example that I will use. But do you mind, Diana, telling us a little bit about this wine, how it's made, what you can tell us about it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, so obviously you're doing a Vega Sicilia tasting, and you might be wondering, what are we drinking a wine from Hungary, right? Well, this is 100% Vega Sicilia wine. The Vega Sicilia family, the Alvarez family, purchased the property in the early 1990s when communism ended in Hungary. The government put some state property for sale, and they actually put vineyards for sale. And there were some, well, so obviously Vega Sicilia and some other known names in the wine industry that actually flew there to see what vineyards they were actually selling. Because let's remember that Tokai, that region, is some of the most celebrated and some of the greatest wine terroirs in the world. So just the idea of thinking that they were actually putting that for sale, well, kind of, rang a bell in a lot of people that were already in the industry, including Vega Sicilia. So Pablo Alvarez, the owner, and his brother Emilio actually flew there to see what was for sale, and they decided to purchase the vineyards of Oremos and some of the vineyards surrounding the property. This was in the early 1990s. Mainly, of course, we still focus in the production of dessert wines, but Andras, the technical director there, had always thought that there was a potential to produce a very good dry white wine from Furmint, which is a grape that you have in your glass. This grape is one of the main grapes that is used for the dessert wines. And he really thought there was potential for doing something really interesting with Furmint. Before then, obviously dry white wine was made in the region, but it was usually made in those years where the production of the Asu grapes, the sort of the dried grapes, was not sufficient or was not very good quality. So with the remainder, they would produce a basic white table wine that the farmers and the viticulturists and the wineries drank. But they were not thinking that that region was actually a white wine, dry white wine producing region. They were very focused on dessert wines, which are still fantastic. And they've actually, nowadays, the quality of those dessert wines is superb. But the Furmint had a very interesting, it has very interesting qualities for a dry white wine. First of all, it's planted in volcanic soils. That region of Tokai has volcanic soils. So, and we all, in all our properties, I'll talk about that later, but everything is dry farmed. So we don't irrigate. So naturally the volcanic soils with that dry farming gives the wine a certain minerality that's very interesting. You also have Furmint, that's a grape that's naturally very high in acidity. That's why it is also used for the dessert wines. It's a grape that has very thick skins, so it kind of concentrates the acidity very well during the maturation process. It kind of maintains that acidity. So it's a wine that's high in minerality, high in acidity. And this Furmint, we've actually been doing a lot of research in our property, not only with the clones that we plant, but also with how we interpret those vineyards and how we interpret the vintages. And we have introduced some Burgundy techniques into the making of this wine. By that, what I mean is we partially ferment in stainless steel and partially ferment in oak, but then we give the wine a short aging of about 6 to 8 months in Hungarian oak barrels with some lee steering, which is very well known in Burgundy with the Chardonnay. That lee steering in oak, what gives the wine is a little bit more texture and more weight in the palate. So you have a wine that on one side is going to be very fresh, very, very vibrant because of that acidity I mentioned. And then it's going to be well balanced with a little bit of texture and weight in the palate. So you have a wine that can also be very versatile, and you also get that kind of aromas that you get, like Doc mentioned before, from that aging in lees, and also Furmint, it's a naturally aromatic grape as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. It is that there's a lot of dry ferment out there, and they can be quite lovely, but they tend to be rather linear, and they focus upon the acidity because, as you say, Furmint was, if you had a Zamarodny back in the day, it was pretty much the wine that they didn't use to make the dessert wines that are so famous there, and so famous. When we talk about famous, we're talking going back centuries ago. That centuries ago, one of the 5 or 6 greatest wines in the world, and back in those days they were all dessert wines, was Tokai, without question, Tokai Ashu. So what's fascinating to me is that certain areas have realized that under the right conditions, you can give lees stirring and lees contact to a white wine that has otherwise been just known for bright acidity, and it's been young drinking, and that's been perfectly nice. But this is at a completely different level. And that's what I kind of want to make sure that people understand, that there are wonderful dry ferments out there, but they tend to be a bit more linear and mineral and kind of one note. You're there for the acidity, and that's great. But this has been, to me, become a really successful wine because it still has all the mineral character. It still has all the steeliness of the acidity and the mineral. But then there's this richness to it, and the richness lingers. And I just find it extremely well balanced. I really have to say, I think it's as successful an example of dry ferment as you're going to find in the market right now.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's getting a little bit more well known as a region and as a grape. Because it's also interesting to go a little bit outside the box and taste different grapes and such. And we really think, with Furmint is something that the Vega Sicilia team has been really working on getting that wine as right and as polished as we can to give the best expression of Furmint that we were able to give. So 2017, which is a vintage we're drinking today, is one of those vintages that we think we're getting to the point of better understanding that that terroir and that grape, how it actually expresses in its dry version. The first vintage that we released was 2001. So as you can see, it's a process of over 15 years to actually getting to the point. We truly believe that it's time really that gives the makers, the wineries, the families a better knowledge of how to work with those grapes and those terroirs and how to interpret them. So I think we're getting to the point where we're releasing a wine that, a ferment that's really to the level that Andras back in the day had in mind, at least.
Yeah, indeed. Before we leave aside Oremus, I do think, I can't help but jump on my soapbox about Tokai, that it is an extraordinarily ancient dessert wine, an extraordinary wine, extraordinarily difficult to make wine when we start talking about essentia particularly, but any of the various versions. But what I want to say is simply that I still think that there's a lot of learning to be done in the marketplace about the character and quality of those wines. I've been fortunate enough to go there and to taste very old wines there and very young wines. And I think there's a misconception amongst at least some producers that volatile acidity is not just to be tolerated, it's a mark of great Tokai. And when I taste the wines from Oremus, these wines are very clean. They're very well made. They're very well structured. They remind me of the wines of the pre-communist era. It is during, in my view, during the communist era that people's standards began to slip, and that we saw wines that had increasing levels of volatile acidity, and the world became convinced that, well, that's okay, that's just how it is. And it's like, no, have one of the dessert wines, one of the Tokais from Oremus, and you will see that modern wine and traditionalism can coexist, and they do. I just think people should check these wines out.
Yeah, of course. I think Vega Sicilia, and I think the philosophy that we have is obviously a philosophy where there's evolution in what we do, and it's taking the best out of the new knowledge that we have, the new technology that we have, but keeping the traditions and keeping it as close as we can to pretty much preserving everything that, to do the work in a way that everything that is there can be preserved for future generations. This being said, Vega Sicilia and the Alvarez family, and I'm sure you've been to the wineries are, and this is a comment we get all the time, is they're extremely clean. You could literally just like throw yourself on the floor and sleep there, and you would not have an issue with doing that. There's a certain level of attention to detail that comes with those specific things. That nowadays there are a lot of, it's not only a lot of acidities, even bread and other little things that come into wine that are no longer considered a fault. And that's obviously something to agree with or not, but it's true. Why wine is a natural product. People can be okay with that or not. But you will find that in our wines is generally they're super clean, they're very polished, and yeah, that is something that we continuously work for in a way. I think somebody there was asking us if we have property somewhere else other than in Hungary. No, it's Spain and Hungary. For now, those are, it's not that it's out of the question, but for now it's only Spain and Hungary. And Hungary, the reason, like I mentioned in the beginning, was because it's one of the greatest terroirs and there were vineyards for sale there. And it looked like, well, obviously the Alvarez family, they were huge fans of Tokai from the pre-communist era, and they saw it as a huge opportunity to do something interesting. What you were mentioning about the communist era is not only that. Let's remember that during that time, the wine was produced mainly for Russia as a market, and they were looking more for volume rather than quality in a way. And to produce volume, obviously you had to sacrifice other things. I was there in the winery last September with a group, and they were actually explaining to us that a lot of the wines from that era, which we actually have in our cellar, were fortified as well. So
yeah, well, and exactly to your point, during the communist era, and you know, understand it's a different mindset, but the wineries became co-ops. The co-ops were there to support a wide variety of farmers. But as we know from the wine business, there are exceptions, of course, but in general, co-ops produce wines more focused upon quantity than they are of quality. There's of course exceptions. Please don't, send me hate mail for leaving out, Cause de Bussy or, a million other so-called co-ops that we could talk about. But there's no question that during the communist era, the wine suffered. And since that time, certain estates have quickly risen above, and Oremus is one of those. Now, Mark had a question. he just wanted us to describe what we view as the flavors of Furmint. And for me, it is definitely a ripe Bosc pear sort of character, but with a lot of citrus to it. We could talk about some herbal or even slightly rooty sorts of background flavors. How do you describe Furmint, Diana? How would you want people to think about the grape?
I would agree with you. I get some notes of stone fruit in a way that you traditionally also associate with wines from that region. I don't know if that's also the reason why I immediately pull them in this wine.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I do find it's a wine that has a minerality that is that you can taste, and I actually can smell it in a way as well. It has this minerality that kind of pops through, and obviously the citrus that you mentioned comes from that really fresh, high acidity in the palate that you can taste right away. I would say those are the main three components. Of course, if you want to sort of stay with the glass for a little while, you will eventually get a little bit more into detail. Like we said, some of the notes that come from the lees, aging, the Sommelier with the lees and everything, you can also get a little bit of the notes of that. But I would mainly classify it in citrus and eventually those mineral notes that come. Herbal notes, you can get some in certain vintages because we do have a vintage effect in the region as well. So certain vintages, you can definitely get a little bit more herbal notes, more floral notes. But normally what you would get, it's more kind of citrus, stone fruit, and mineral character to the wine.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I guess I would say, just to again make sure that this is sort of out of the way as well. I know there are some people who object to describing wines as having mineral notes or having mineral character. Those people will say, well, you're just smelling sulfur compounds and tasting sulfur compounds, and it's really has nothing to do with the soil. And I would say, I would respond to that with a wine word. It's a very specific wine word. It's bullshit. That's right, bullshit. As far as I'm concerned, mineral character exists in wines. What I will agree with is we don't know how and why, but if you have a palate and if you're a sentient human being, you have noticed mineral character in a number of wines. And so I think it's very obvious in this wine. And every ferment I've ever had, I felt like that was there. That is a factor, you know, if I'm to describe the wine appropriately.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely think, I mean, I agree. I mean, obviously wine is very subjective, so you can go into very different descriptions of wine, and that's why it's better to kind of everyone get their own description of what they smell. But I agree that I do think mineral notes are present in wines. I do think that wines that are sometimes, that are dried farm or they're very in those kind of, in terms of the production or the way the wines are treated in the vineyard, I think that kind of enhances sometimes the mineral notes in the final wine. And I've tasted it, so I do think it is also a way of how you describe minerality or how, because it's also a little bit subjective what you perceive as minerality. I think in this wine, I say it's mineral, and I think it's pretty obvious, but for obviously maybe for other people can get other characters. And I think someone says it's a little bit like Riesling. I think with age, ferment, when it starts aging, it starts to get a little, some of those kind of oxidative notes that you get with Riesling. It's not exactly the same, but with age, eventually it shows a little bit more characteristics of Riesling than when it's young.
Yeah, sometimes I'll get, as it gets older, I'll get sort of a waxy note that some would regard as like Riesling, but I'd almost regard it more like Semillon, that it can be like a sort of old Semillon. And somebody else asked about Roussanne, and Roussanne for me is oxidative even when it's young, and yet hangs on for a long time. And it's very floral, and I wouldn't consider Furmint a floral grape. I don't typically, you know, maybe Harzlevelu has a little bit of florality to it, and certainly the Muscateller grapes do, but Furmint to me, you know, it's a backbone grape, I think, in Tokai, and here it's just been, you know, made into something rather richer and rounder and quite, yeah, it's a damn good version. I'll just say that. So good. So what do you think? Should we move on to the Pintia, to the Toro wine?
Yeah, let's move to the reds. Yeah. Yeah.
So we are having Pintia. An estate that, well, I should let you talk about Pintia. We can talk about Toro a little bit, but first I should let you tell us about the estate, and then maybe you and I can talk about Toro, the place.
Of course. So what can I tell you? So Vega Sicilia, like I said, the group has 5 wineries. It's Vega Sicilia, the main state. It's a state that was founded in 1864. It's where we produce Único, where we produce Valbuena, that we're going to taste last, and Único Reserva Especial. And the Alvarez family purchased this state in 1982. And since then, they have been creating other projects, mainly in Spain and the one in Oremus. And when I mean creating other projects is that these wineries, one of them is Pintia. These are projects that are started from scratch. These are not wineries that the family just buys. This means that they go out, they look for the vineyards, sometimes they plant the vineyards, and it can take from 5 to 10 years to release the first vintage into the market. So it's a process that requires a lot of patience and a lot of investment. And one of those projects is Pintia, the one that we wanted to show you today, that is in the Toro region. So basically following the Douro River, which starts in Peñafiel in Ribera del Duero, all the way to Portugal, sort of right a little bit in the middle, you find this region of Toro. That we think it's getting really interesting wines out there right now. Sometimes it's a region that it's very extreme in weather conditions. It can get extremely hot in the summer and during the day, very cold in the winter, and at night there's almost no water. So what happens is that we have to plant the vines very apart. The density of plantation is very low, so the vines have to go really down the roots, and you get Tinta de Toro, which is the name of Tempranillo that's given to Tempranillo in Toro. It's called Tinta de Toro. It's a clone of Tempranillo that gives very, very concentrated wines. So this is what you have with Pintia. It's a project that we have also been working a lot every single year to try to make the most balanced, elegant version we can of Toro. And we think with this most recent vintages, we're getting to the point where we're really understanding the vintage. Doug, you're probably going to explain a little bit more about the region, but when I mention no water, this is a very general term that we use in the wine industry, average rainfall in the year, but just to give you a number, in this region like Toro is like 11 inches average rainfall in a year. Regions that are already dry, like Rioja and Ribera, can get 15 to 18. So we get almost no water during the year. And everything we do is dry farming. Remember, in all of our vineyards is dry farming. And all of the work that we do in the vineyards throughout the year, it's done by hand. So we really don't mechanize the vineyards at all. What we look in Toro, in specific, is harvesting, picking a harvest day where we can actually have a grape that's mature, that has not those rustic green tannins that you can get in Toro if you harvest too early. But you don't want to wait too long, that you get these grapes that are a little bit over mature, and then you get that kind of jammy feeling, high alcohol in the mouth that you can get with those grapes. So picking harvest date in Toro is crucial. We try to preserve some nice fresh acidity in the berry that we can translate into the final wine. So with this Toro wine, you're gonna get the color, you're gonna get the concentration that you naturally get from Toro. You get that power. And we try to balance it out with a nice fresh acidity in the wine. And also in the cellar, we really try to minimize extraction. We try to also do an aging in oak that allows the wine to integrate better. And we let it sit in bottle for 3 years before actually releasing it to the market. Tempranillo, and especially Tinta de Toro, we do believe that's a wine that requires time. So if you let it sit for a little bit in bottle, you're eventually gonna come to a wine that's still gonna be expressive, but it's gonna lose that kind of really first rustic punch that you can get from the Toro region.
Yeah, Toro really is, it's just like the name sounds. It's like bull, and my earliest experiences back in the 70s of Spanish wine, aside from Rioja, aside from sherry, what maybe one of the most famous was Gran Collegiata from Toro. And those wines tended to be a bit rustic, and nonetheless, they're really compelling because it was as if we were seeing a new face of Tempranillo. And exactly as you say, the critical element in Toro is that it's kind of a perfect spot. At least I would say I've seen some of the most exciting vineyards in my life in Toro, where down on the flats, it's corn, it's grain, it's not for anything having to do with the vine, but you get up in some of the plateaus and it's intensely dry up there. And as the vines get older, they're able to work their way down, and so there's one, I still remember a friend of mine saying to me when I was tasting some of this very old Vine Toro wine, and I was saying it was extraordinary to me because clearly we talk about how old vines make great wine. And he said, you know, Doug, I really have to question that as an axiom. We say it all the time, but what is it, what if it is that great vineyards are allowed to get old? And so we associate great wine with these old vineyards. And when I was in Toro, I saw 100-year-old vines that were producing massive amounts of grapes, and yet we're producing great wine. And we always say, oh, old vines give us very small crops. Well, it wasn't happening like that. And when I stood in Toro and took pictures, I still remember thinking, it's like the gods said, right here, we're going to make a perfect place, just this little sort of convex place where every grapevine is going to be able to soak up some sun. And as you say, the trick is, can you make elegant wine in Toro? So this is, to answer a question, this is like 70% or so French oak and 30% American.
Yes.
And
yes, so answering the question about the aging, it ages for 12 months in oak and 3 years in bottle before release. And the aging in oak is usually 70 to 80% French oak, new oak, and the rest is American oak, about 20 to 30% American oak. It's all new oak. The tannic structure of Tinta de Toro can actually handle that new oak. We think it's a good interaction. It can handle it. Tempranillo from that region. If you go, we actually have a property in Rioja, for example, and we also try to do what we do in Toro and in Ribera with new oak, and Tempranillo from Rioja can't handle new oak like that. But Toro does, and it's 12 years of aging in oak, and then, like I said, 3 years in bottle before release. 2015, we think it's a very elegant version of Toro. You get the expression, the power, the concentration. You know, it's a big wine. It's balanced with a nice acidity, but it's certainly a wine that you can put down for 5 years more, and it's gonna keep evolving in bottle. It's gonna gain a lot more elegance, and it's gonna integrate well better.
Yeah, and when you talk about not over extracting what is there, I think that's so critical to help people understand that typically Pintia is done with a cold maceration, 4 or 5 days. And the reason to do that is you extract color and flavor, but you don't extract necessarily tannin because it's a non-alcoholic maceration. And so by being able to do that early on, when it's just, you know, if you will, a water maceration, you know, you're just dealing with water inside the grapes, you're not extracting all the bitterness, but you're extracting this flavor. And then, you know, you don't need to over extract at the back end of the wine, and you end up with what to me is just an incredibly elegant. I've just always been a big, since Pintia was created, I've been a big fan. Diana seems to be frozen here. Can you all hear me okay? We good? I am going to see if I can just do a quick share screen while we're waiting for Diana to come back. And, oh, okay. If I can get Michelle to allow screen sharing real quickly, I will just show some pictures real quick. If you'll allow me to do so, either Michelle or Jen, I'd like to do a quick share screen. And we'll just talk about Vega Sicila, because I mean, right, it's time. Shall we go to the motherland, as it were, and really see where we're talking about here? Now, this is Toro on the left. You can see here, this is the badly drawn version of this, but this is the river Duero, and Ribera del Duero, from whence Vega Sicilia comes, is the banks of the river Duero. Toro is a little bit farther down, farther downstream, and then you end up with just the border, if you will, of Portugal and Spain, exactly as Diana said, and eventually we find our way all the way into Portugal. Oh, hey, there you are. We'll end up with the Douro Valley here, and eventually the river will, you know, end up at the Pacific Ocean here. Remember what we think about the Douro in Portugal, where port comes from, is it's remote, it's inaccessible, it's hot, it's difficult. We're upstream from here. I wouldn't say that it's difficult, but I would say it's important to remember that these are elevated sites, and those elevated sites allow us to retain acidity because it gets cold at night. I certainly remember my very first trip. It was early July, and the temperature during the day was in the 90s. And I remember my host saying how hot it was, and they were so sorry. And I was thinking, I live in Kansas City, where if it's 94 degrees, it's 94% humidity. You don't know what hot is like, you know, when it's 90% humidity or more. And then that night, the temperature dropped into the 40s. That doesn't happen in a lot of places, but it helps retain acidity. And so here we are at the River Duero, not exactly the most picturesque version of it, but I like to show this picture because it's certainly changed. But over the years, when I visited Ribera del Duero, this is what the vineyards often look like. And then, if you'll allow me, this is what the vineyards look like when Vega Sicilia owns them. They are so well manicured, so well cared for. I mean, it does immediately feel like you've gone to a completely different level, and you have. Now, understand, what these woods are all about is that's where the river is. So the banks of the River Duero, as you can see on either side, we will see vineyards on both sides of the river. Now, here we are, in the town, and I always have to show this because this is a fermenter that you probably won't see in very many places. It was designed by Vega Sicilia for Vega Sicilia, and the notion is that this particular fermenter, it's looks like a spaceship capsule. What you're allowed to do is to manage tannins a little bit better, and so though you can do pump overs, you're not going to extract as much tannin with the pump overs in this machine as you would in a more standard upright fermenter. That at least is how it was explained to me, and I would say based on the results, it seems like a pretty good bet. Now, you'll forgive me because Alejandro Fernandez has nothing to do with Vega Sicilia. He's a well-known personality there because he is an outsized personality, but I bring him in to say, though he would, I'm sure, deny it today, I met him in 1985, and he told me that he was giving it up, that he was going back to making farm equipment or selling farm equipment or making funny water wheels as he has done here because he couldn't make a decent living. Bear in mind, certainly from the moment the Alvarez family buys Vega Sicilia in 1982, but certainly prior to that, all the way back into the 40s, and of course, as Diana said, back into the 1840s, the estate exists, the winery exists, the wines exist, but the reputation of Vega Sicilia was such that it was assumed, I would argue primarily by the international press, it was assumed that no winery could measure up to Vega Sicilia, that nothing around Vega Sicilia would ever measure up to Vega Sicilia because Vega Sicilia was a thing apart. And I would argue, well, yes, that's true, but I think that in the last 10 or 20 years, we've begun to see other estates look at Vega Sicilia, be inspired by the excellence there, and try to do better and better work, okay? So if you'll allow me, we're looking at Tintafino. There are white grapes here as well. So this is me wandering around Vega Sicilia and taking pictures, basically. I would say that Vega Sicilia as an estate is extraordinarily beautiful. It is one of those places, when you go, not if, when you go to Ribera del Duero, you need to visit. It's an extraordinary place. It's incredibly beautiful. The house itself is beautiful. But what is a little striking to me, that's stainless steel. Most people, if you have a crush pad, are covered up by a roof. But Vega Sicilia is a thing apart. Maybe the most astounding thing I saw in one of my visits there was right after, this is about 20 years ago, right after, well, maybe 15 years ago, right after the shocking discovery that TCA could happen inside a winery as well. And we were calling it tribromo anisole. And it was found in the wood blocks upon which people were leaving sometimes barrels. Most people took the wood out and put in just, metal racks, or they put in wood and painted it and treated it and such. Vega Sicilia put in stainless steel racks, stainless steel chalks even. And I remember turning to Pablo Alvarez and saying, this is amazing. Did this cost you $2 or $3 million? I'm sort of joking. And he looked at me and he said, yes, I think so. And it was one of those moments of, oh my God, they will do anything to try to make the very best wine they possibly can. It was shocking. It was striking to me. And I still can't quite get over it, as you can tell. But it is this remarkable, I guess I would say, it's like a confluence of what you see in Bordeaux, where Chateau Lafite makes great wines. Its vineyards are right next to a fifth growth, let's say. And yet the wines of Chateau Lafite maybe are great partially because they've always been paid to be great. They learned how to tell that story. And so they had more money to pump into greatness and to continue greatness. And I will always tell that story with regards to Vega Sicilia, because I think it's part of why Vega Sicilia is so important and has been the lodestar, arguably until the creation of L'Ermita, the only truly internationally recognized wine of Spain. It's a thing apart. I would just continue to say it is a thing apart. There are many great Spanish wines. Those of you who know me know I'm rather passionate about Spanish wine and many estates there, but Vega Sicilia, it has to be viewed as something separate, something singular.
And I guess we're moving to Valbuena. So just coming back to the point that you were saying, I think it kind of ties with what I'm going to tell you now. So Vega Sicilia, the farm, it's about a 1,000 hectare farm. I apologize, I don't know the conversion to acres. I should know by now, but I always have an issue with that.
That's about 2,500 acres, 2,500 acres.
And there's only about 200 hectares of vineyard. Back in the day, the farm was actually what we call in Spanish an hacienda. So the people that actually worked there, lived inside the property. And it was not only wine. I actually remember that back in the day, vines were planted where nothing else could grow. And you planted the vines where you could not grow potatoes, or you could not grow cereals, or you could not grow something that you could feed yourself with, right? So the farm had other crops, had other things. Eventually in the 80s, when the Alvarez family arrived, they decided to stop the production of other crops to focus solely in wine. And from there, the Alvarez family, like Doc said, has been investing not only in the cellar with those little details that sound like it's nothing. If you actually go to the property and the winemaking facilities, everything was redone in 2010. And Gonzalo, our winemaker, now has actually one actual tank, fermenting tank, for every single plot that we have in the vineyard. So before that, there was a whole investment that was done in research and development, and that investment went into the vineyards because the family understood that the most precious thing that Vega Sicilia has is obviously those vineyards that are something special. It's a place where, for some reason, those vines are so well adapted and we get fruit of such a high quality that allows us to make fantastic wines. So that is really the most important asset that we have. And they invested a lot of money in research and development to understand the vineyard. And they actually mapped out the vineyards, and they discovered that we have in our vineyard only 19 different types of soils, and they mapped it out in 56 different plots. And Gonzalo actually has 56 fermenting tanks in the cellar. That means that we actually can do a single vineyard from every single plot, and then Gonzalo starts doing the blending. Basically, that's the way it does. The reason I'm saying that is because Valbuena comes from those vineyards. And there's obviously, from those 56 different plots, there's certain plots that are usually Único plots. There's certain plots that are usually Valbuena plots. But nothing really gets decided until the grapes are harvested. And they actually see what the evolution of the wine is in the first stages of the aging process. And once the actual wine it's fermented and it starts aging, they start looking at how it evolves, and they decide which plots are going to Valbuena and which plots are going to Único. We do have a huge vintage effect in the region, so every vintage can be different. So we cannot really tell this plot is always going to be Único. Sometimes that plot, for some reason, that plot can be put into Valbuena, or maybe a plot that usually goes into Valbuena goes to Único. So that's why we also say that Valbuena is one of the greatest offers that Vega Sicilia has, because it really comes from those 56 different plots that get treated exactly the same way. They get harvested and vinified by plot. And then depending on the evolution, we decide which ones goes to Valbuena. Valbuena is a wine that only has 5 years of aging, about 3 years in oak and 2 in bottle, and that gets released. So we're looking for Valbuena is gonna have a really good aging capacity. It can age for maybe 20, 30 years, depending on the vintage, or even more, but it's gonna evolve faster than Único. It's a wine that evolves faster in bottle. Único is a wine that tends to stay young for a really long time. And the aging process in oak, now that I'm talking about the aging, it's much more complex than what we discussed for Pintia, because we use French and American oak, and we also use barrels, the normal size 225 liter barrels that you know, and we also use oak vats, 10,000 and even larger formats of oak vats. So throughout the aging process, the wine is racked from one format to another, giving, you know, different amounts of contact with oxygen to that wine from the smaller format to the bigger format. We also think that that aging that is given to Valbuena and obviously to Unico, which is a wine, an aging that's longer in oak, gives the wine a certain stability that allows it to age very well in bottle afterwards. And then Valbuena ages for 2 years in bottle before release to the market. And we think it's a Vega Sicilia that's more ready to drink when released. It's more approachable when it's released than Unico. Unico tends to still be young. Nowadays, the vintages have been very generous, and you can have Unicos that are very drinkable, but has such a bigger potential that you'd rather just keep it for later. Valbuena is a wine that can age really well if you want to put it down for a few years. It's going to gain a lot in elegance. It's going to evolve beautifully, but it's a Vega Sicilia that's more ready to drink in a way. That's how we perceive it. But Doug, I don't know your comments. You've tasted plenty of this.
Oh yeah, no, I feel exactly the same. Valbuena is what enables you to age your Unico, because you can keep your hands off Unico because when you have to have a Sicilia, you can drink a Valbuena and you haven't committed, you know, infanticide. Unico, it tastes perfectly fine when it's young and not long after release, but it's that long aging becomes incredible. For me, one of the greatest experiences of my tasting life was a million years ago at a Wine Spectator tasting in New York. Vega Sicilia wasn't really, you know, this is decades ago, it wasn't very well known. And it was the very first one that the Wine Spectator had put together. And Pablo Alvarez had shown up to pour 1962 Unico. And of course, you were supposed to go up to each table and get your little, you know, half-ounce taste and then leave and go away. But no one was bothering him. So I just stood there and I would take a taste, I would drink some 62, and then I would leave for 10 minutes. I would come back and say, may I try it again? And he would get another little taste. And it was just, I mean, that moment is seared in my mind, or the 82 or what have you, that if you can just give Unico enough time, it takes on a texture that only aged wines can give you. I think Valbuena, the beauty of it is when it's released, you will get a glimpse of what aged Vega Sicilia tastes like because of, you know, this large format, because of the, you know, 10,000 plus liter aging that's available. And yet, as you say, it'll age. I have no problem with that. I have 10 and 15-year-old Valbuena in my cellar that I'm in no hurry to drink. Although after this, I'm suddenly thinking, why haven't I consumed those lately? You know, I need to open those. But it's hard for me not to get just completely jazzed when I drink wine like this, because immediately, of course, I'm thinking about roast goat or roast lamb. I'm thinking how I wish I was in Valladolid and we were having, you know, we were going to a lovely restaurant and we were having roast you know, lamb or roast goat. But just that it's a beautifully, as you walk through the vineyards, it has its own savory element as well. There's a lot of other, you know, flora growing around you that I think adds elements to these aromas. I couldn't tell you precisely how. You'll see things like wild fennel and such growing about, but it just seems to add to the complexity. And the wine, I mean, this wine screams to me this place in ways that I just can't ever stop being amazed by. It is, isn't it, why we get excited about certain wines, is they can embody a place.
I actually forgot to mention, so this Valbuena, it's about 95% Tinto Fino or Tempranillo and a 5% Merlot. So Vega Sicilia, historically, it was a state that was actually planted with many other varietals. We still have Cab that we use for Unico, but there was Malbec, there was Petit Verdot, there were some white varietals as well. Actually, our most iconic plot or parcel in the vineyard, it's a plot that was planted maybe 100 years ago, and it was planted the way they used to plant back in the day. So it was not by rows, it was not one varietal by plot, it was different varietals. There was white and there was red and there was everything, and they would just harvest everything and produce it. So the Unicos up to the 70s, maybe early 80s, were actually blend wines, and the Valbuena as well. They were blends of Tempranillo. Actually, up until 2008, Valbuena had some Malbec in the blend. But as we've been replanting the vineyards with everything that I mentioned about the research and development, we're trying obviously to do a whole research of trying to keep our genetic material. So we try to clone our own vines. We try to do a muscle selection try replanting our own clones. And we've discovered that it's really Tempranillo what grows best where we are. So both Valbuena and Unico we have been focusing more on Tempranillo. Everything that we plant in Tempranillo, in Vega Sicilia, in Toro, in Oleon, in Rivera, everything is planted bush vine and everything is dried farm. We believe that's the method of the trellising system that works best for Tempranillo, at least where we are based. And that's how we treat Tempranillo everywhere we are. But Valbuena usually does have a small percentage of Merlot. There were vintages like 2011 and 12 that we decided to go 100% in the Fino, and vintages where we include a little bit of Merlot. And Unico usually has between a 3 and a 5% cab in the blend as well. It's a small percentage, but we believe it's there. It kind of completes the wine. It gives it the final structure that we are looking for in both of these wines.
I didn't realize the Valbuena 11 and 12 didn't have the Merlot. I assumed it was always a little bit of Merlot.
Yes. Yeah.
And
so yeah, we don't know. Maybe eventually we'll be 100% in Tofino. We do think Merlot actually grows well. The Malbec, it's not that we didn't want to include it. It's just that Malbec eventually did not grow well. When we tried to replant those vineyards of Malbec, because I mean, if you taste Valbuena 2006 and 7 right now, the wine is superb. So you would think, why would they actually remove the Malbec? We tried to not remove it. We tried to replant it, but eventually the quality of the fruit that we would get from those new plantations of those new crops were not really the quality that we were getting from the Asian Malbec that we had in the property that we eventually had to remove. So if we were not getting the quality, we decided to just stop working with Malbec.
I see. And is there still some Albio there, some of the white grapes left, or have they?
There is some white grapes in the really old plots, because it's like I mentioned, it's one of these really old plots that we keep there, that they're still harvested, they're still used for the wines, but it's because it's only one plot, it's really minimum, the percentage. And it's usually the plot that's used to do the pied de cuve, to start the fermentation for the other plots. But there's still, yeah, the ones that are there, we still keep it. We have some Tempranillo Blanco, some Albillo, some Garnacha, etc. In Vega Sicilia, there was, because we do get the question if we're ever releasing a white wine from Vega Sicilia, there was not the intention, but everything kind of goes through kind of a test period before. And there were some vineyards that were planted in Vega Sicilia with white varietals. And those were actually, in the end, not used. And now they actually planted them with Tempranillo, I think, a few years ago. And now, yeah, the white wine project is not going to happen anymore. Yeah.
Well, we're grateful that we continue to see these amazing wines from Vega Sicilia. It is for me. I mean, like I say, I hate to be sort of starstruck by wines, because I admire wines from so many places, and yet I have to say that there is still something that's just stunning to me. Anytime I taste these wines, I'm fascinated by their sort of presence, and the presence is, of course, the color and the tannins, which are present, but they're well managed. And the Merlot, I'm sure, adds some sort of weighty, easy going element to it. At the same time, Merlot can have sort of a tea or a pipe tobacco sort of element to it. And Tempranillo, to me, is amazing at its ability to show the other flora and that grows around it, to express some of that too. So that small amount of Merlot, I think, does something really special to Valbuena. As with Unico, that Cabernet, that cedar note, that black peppery note, just seems to make Unico even a little sterner in its youth, and even more stunning in its, when it's 10, 20, 30. Been lucky enough to have 40-year-old Unico, and they're in fantastic shape. I tell people, typically, don't worry about waiting too long. It will be there when you get there. It's the only problem is having that kind of patience when you know how delicious the wines are.
Yes. Well, thank you. And no, and I think what's surprising and what sort of has put in a certain way Vega Sicilia on the map in a way is those experiences. The fact that if you open a bottle of wine nowadays that's maybe 20, 30 years old, it's an experience. It's something different, because also the wine that you're tasting is something that you you don't taste every day. It develops, obviously that's the way that's the reason you put it down. You put it down so that when you open it, it's going to show a wine that's a different experience. That's something that you're not going to taste every day. And I think that's one of the reasons, just their capacity of aging and evolving in bottle. It's very unique, and it gives you some of those kind of wow experiences when you actually wait and open it. But Vega Sicilia, well, Valbuena, in a way, like I said, it's a Vega Sicilia wine. Is just a Vega Sicilia that we believe it's more approachable when it's young, and it's more ready to drink when it's young, and will age beautifully, but it's going to age a little bit faster than Unico. This year, we released the 2010 Unico. Unico is a wine that's usually aged for 10 years. And if we were to put Valbuena 2010 next to Unico 2010 and taste it blind, you would think that Valbuena would be the older wine, or would be, you know, a wine that's way more evolved. You would still think that Unico, it's sort of a younger wine for some reason. It's a wine that it just, like I said, it just keeps young for a long time. It has that fruit and that profile of a wine that has not evolved very fast, at least for the first 10 years or so.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think Valbuena is supposed to get you through to the moment when Unico is 15 or 20 or 25 years old.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a question from Dave. If you want to unmute Dave.
Hello, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Great. Hey, Doug and Diana, I've really enjoyed this. This is incredible, and I'm an absolute Vega Sicilia fan, and one of the probably 5 greatest properties in the world. And given their 5 first growths, that means you're up above that. But I'm intrigued by what Diana said about how Unico is young longer, and Doug, you added some detail to that in terms of Unico's got the extra bit of cab that adds some of that character to it, as opposed to the Merlot and the Valbuena, which is lovely right now. My question to you, Diana, is what's done in terms of block selection, or what's done in the vineyard differently, and what's done in the winery differently between the Valbuena and the Unico, separating out the barrel treatment and so forth? How do you create those different characteristics that lead to these different but such similar wines?
Okay. So really, in the vineyard, I would say there's really no difference. The plots are treated the same way. And like I mentioned, which plots go to Unico gets decided once the wine is vinified, and even when it starts doing it, the first stages of the aging process. So even in the first stages of the aging process, that first stage for those Unico and Valbuena, it's aging in barrel, French and American oak barrel. So those first stages of the aging, they're done by, let's say, by plot. It doesn't really get, and then they start selecting which barrels are evolving, are showing a potential for a longer evolution based on concentration, tannins, acidity, etc. Then I think a key factor in Unico, Doug mentioned obviously Cabernet Sauvignon is a part of it, but it's in a very small percentage, but it also obviously gives some qualities of Cabernet to the aging potential of Unico. But another important factor is that Unico stays in oak for 5 years. The first year and a half or so, it's in oak barrels, the size that we know, that we see that Doug showed in the picture. And then it goes into larger formats. So Unico is a wine that for the first 5 years, it's gonna be in contact with small amounts of oxygen through the oak aging. So that microoxygenation for such a long time, we believe that it gives the wine a certain stability. So once you put it in bottle, the wine can actually evolve slower than you would eventually see a wine that's only been aged for 1 year or not, or hasn't been aged at all. We believe that because the wine has already been in contact with the smallest portions of oxygen, it gives the wine a certain stability. We do believe that our aging process for the wines, especially for Unico, is a key factor in the aging potential of the wine in the end. In terms of, like I said, the vineyard, there's no real difference. In terms of Valbuena, well, it has a little bit of Merlot, but the aging is only going to be about 3 years in oak and 2 in bottle, and it's going to show a faster evolution than Unico, of course. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, well, the microoxygenation, yes, you can kind of get a sense of that. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I can't wait to get over and visit.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was a fantastic answer, Diana, because I think it is a little mysterious when people want to know how it is those decisions are made. As you say, it's not as simple as saying, well, this block can be relied on. It's always going to be an Unico, and this block is always going to be Valbuena, because it is different vintage to vintage. And I do think that one of the issues about an elevated site like Vega Sicilia and Ribera del Duero in general is that cooler vintages are going to require a different site or a different set of decisions than a warmer vintage. In a warmer vintage, places like Ribera del Duero, I think, prosper more so than Toro. In a cooler vintage, Toro is going to do great, but a place like Ribera del Duero, you're going to have to pick and choose those sites because it is a place that's elevated enough that it cools off at night, and ripening is not a foregone conclusion in Ribera del Duero as it is in places like Toro or down in south like Umia and Priorat and such. So
we do have two important factors in Ribera is that we do have, remember, hail or frost in months that like April, May, where you already have you already have the potential fruit there. That's a common thing that we have in the region that we have to deal with every year. We produce, as long as we can, we produce wines every year, but you would see in Unico, for example, 10, the vintage that we released this year, was a very by the book vintage, was a very generous vintage, was a very good vintage in the region. 09 was a little bit warmer, but also eventually we got a little bit of rain and balanced out all that warm weather that we had throughout the year. So also very good vintage. But then we have 8 and 7 that were cooler vintages in the region. We produce less Unico, also higher quality, but you have other factors. You have a little bit higher acidity. It's the Unico and both Unico, Valbuena, I think all of our wines, but specifically the Ribera del Duero wines and Vega Sicilia, you can actually taste the vintage effect, the vintage difference. It's huge. In Toro, it's a region that is not so evident. You don't see it that much because it changes from one year to the other in Toro. It's a region that's a little bit more stable year after year. Ribera del Duero, you can have a year like this year that was very nice. It was warm, it was generous by the book. We got the rain when we had to get it, etc. And then you get years, I don't know, like 2017 or eventually 7 or 8, where we had hail, we had frost, we had a lot of rain. So years that are a lot more difficult to handle the vineyard for eventually, yeah.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you. That explanation helps a great deal. Any other questions? Does anyone else have any curiosities in this? I certainly would be curious about age of vines, how much you think that's a factor, and how, with such a large estate, how Vega Sicilia is continuing to make sure that the old vines are a source, but that there are, at least old enough vines that are being replanted and replenished within the vineyards. How is that process unfolding in Vega Sicilia in the modern era?
So yeah, there's a whole program of replanting. Like I said, we replant our own clones. We have a whole program of clone reproduction and massal selection from our vineyards. We replant our vineyards constantly. If you actually go to the property, you'll see that there's always a vineyard that it's recently planted or it's getting planted. We still keep our very ancient vineyards, of course, because not only because of the production that they give, but also because it's part of, well, the patrimony, kind of the iconic part of Vega Sicilia is seeing and knowing that you have that 100-year-old vineyard there. But as a general philosophy in Vega Sicilia, we do believe that it's kind of a balance between old and young vines. Average age of our vineyards is about 45-year-old vines. And Pablo always says this, but he actually thinks that 45 is the perfect age for vines. He says this because he thinks that vines are like humans, and you wouldn't expect a 100-year-old human to give the quality of or the production that a 45-year-old or eventually, right? He thinks that 45 is kind of like the age where both vines, he thinks that it's an age that vines really do give their best fruit and their best production, both in volume and in quality. So in Vega Sicilia, we have about 45-year-old vines. In Pintia, I remember, I didn't mention this, but we have about 75 of our vineyards are ungrafted because Pintia is, well, the region in general didn't really get attacked by phylloxera at the time because it has a lower soil that it's mainly sandy soil. So it was kind of safe from that. But about 75% of our vineyards are also very old vineyards, over 40, 50-year-old vineyards, and they're all ungrafted as well. So in general, in all of our properties, we do really care a lot for the older vines, but we do believe that the younger vines actually also contribute to that freshness and that fruit in the wines that is also very, very important. We don't use the vines until they're over 10 years old. Before that, we always sell the grapes, but we do think that both young and old, it has to have kind of have a balance there.
A question came through from Ryan, which is a 91 Unico. How soon should that be consumed? My view on 91 Unico would be you could consume it now. That's fine. But you also have, if you want it, 10 or maybe even 20 years left on that wine. How do you feel about it, Diana?
Yes, I think you can definitely open it, and you're already going to have a great surprise. I think 91 Unico is already going to be about 30 years. So it's definitely an age where Unico is perfect. We think Unico, ideally after 20 years, you can start consuming the wine. So if you have an Unico 2010, honestly, you can open it right now and you think it's a beautiful wine. It is a beautiful wine. But if you wait, it's going to get way better. So that's why we say, it's not that you cannot drink Unico right now. It's not like those old Bordeaux that you opened them when they were young and it's just acid. No, it's really going to be beautiful, but it's going to get better. And we think 20 years for Unico, it's a great time to wait. After 20 years, you can open it and you're still going to have a great experience. I would think it's probably 30. It's probably a good time to open it. It's especially the 91, but you can definitely wait. It's a good vintage of Unico, so you can definitely wait 10 or up to 50 years to open the wine. Yeah.
And Felipe Gonzalez Gordon is with us, and he wanted to know if you could explain a little bit about the cooperage project at Vega Sicilia and the planting of oak trees, sort of a long-term project to be able to supply cooperage for Vega Sicilia. This is not something I know much about. I think it probably, is more of an experiment than so I've not been aware of this. Do you have something?
Well, we actually do have our own cooper at Vega Sicilia. I don't know if were you visiting that part of when you were there?
Yeah, we saw that, but I didn't know about the oak trees being planted there to supply the cooper.
No, one thing it's the cooper. The cooper has been there for 3 generations. It's Jesus Enrique. He was born in Vega Sicilia when the people that worked in the farm lived there. He no longer lives there, but he was born in Vega Sicilia, and he's now the head of the whole cooperage program that we have there. And we focus mainly on American oak barrels. That's what we produce. We buy about 3,000 French oak barrels every year from at least 5 different coopers in France that we use for all of our properties. But the American oak barrels, we actually build those barrels at the property. We buy the oak staves in Ohio and Kentucky. We curate them, import them, curate them, and then we build our own oak barrels. Why? Well, it's a tradition in Vega Sicilia, but also it kind of gives Gonzalo, our winemaker, a lot more flexibility. He is very into detail and doing tests, and so he works really closely with Jose Enrique to selecting and changing toastings in the barrels, like hidden temperature for one vintage. And he's allowed to do that depending on the vintage. Because the French oak barrels, we actually, for this vintage, for example, we purchased the French oak barrels last year. So no matter what happens in the vintage, you already selected your French oak barrels. With the fact that we produce our own American oak barrels, we have a little bit more flexibility to maybe adapt the toasting depending on how the vintage was, if it's a higher acidity, lower acidity, depending on how Gonzalo feels that vintage is going to be, he can actually change certain things and move and test other things with Jose Enrique. So he works really closely with him. And like I said, Vega Sicilia is a lot of attention to detail. So that is one little other step that we go into to assure that also the aging in the American oak barrels is very done to detail. And then the oak tree. So in the late 1990s, you, Doug, must know that Vega recalled a lot of product because we had a huge problem with cork, with TCA. We had a huge problem with a big batch of corks that we use. And Pablo decided to recall a lot of product from Vega Sicilia that was already sold. And he decided then that he was going to plant, going to plant trees in the Vega Sicilia property in order to eventually produce our own corks. So we have about 30 hectares of
cork oak.
cork trees.
Yeah.
And the idea is that eventually the next generation of the Vega Sicilia family, or maybe the future generations, are going to be able to produce their own corks. Honestly, this project was done without really knowing whether that is going to be cork trees that are going to be suitable for cork production. That means we don't know, because obviously the cork production also has a lot of specificities. We hope eventually the quality is going to be enough so that we can use them for our own corks. But if not, that's not a problem. Vega Sicilia actually, the whole, like I said, the whole property is 1,000 hectares. We have a pine tree plantation as well, a forest there. So it's also part of sort of the environment of the whole farm, the fact that there's a cork tree plantation there. So we hope we're going to be able to use them. If we can, well, you already planted a forest there, so it's not going to be a problem. But yeah, the idea is that eventually we produce our own corks, and also, like I said, is the attention to detail. The corks that I don't have the ones that I pulled right now, but the corks that we use now, they actually go through a very specific selection process. So we work with at least 2 different cork producers. The idea is that eventually we have we don't rely only on one, and they both know that they have to stick to really high standards. So they send us obviously their best corks that have already been tested for TSA and everything. So they done their testing, we receive those, and we actually send them to a lab as well. We pay for that, and we get them tested again. And once the lab sends us the best ones, and they cannot say, no, these ones are not gonna work, we actually do a second test in the winery. We actually call it the cork room. And if you go there in a certain time of the year, for about 6 months to 8 months, we have all the corks that we're gonna use to bottle that year have been there for 6 to 8 months in certain conditions, so that we can analyze them after 8 months and see if any of those are actually producing TCA. So the corks that we use go through at least 3 different stages from the cork producer to the test that we do, so that we can guarantee that we're gonna have the least amount of TCA issues that we can get.
That's amazing. I think a lot of people don't realize how expensive it is these days to make sure that you have a cork that has no prospect or very little prospect of having TCA. It's sort of amazing for people to grasp that cork and the labor associated with it could be $2 a cork before it actually goes into the bottle. Now put the distributor's markup on it, the importer's markup, the retail markup on it, and $10 that you just spent, on a bottle of Vega Sicilia might have been spent on that damned cork. It's crazy, but at the same time, exactly that there was, 20 some years ago, there were a lot of wines that were suffering from this, and we were all scratching our heads trying to figure out how to make that problem go away. And I think it's a fraction of the problem that it was 25 and 30 years ago. But Vega Sicilia, not surprisingly, took 2 or 3 extra steps to make sure that it wasn't going to be a factor any longer in Vega Sicilia's, international sales and such. So, well, is there anything else that you would like to make sure that we've covered, Diana? I greatly appreciate your expertise and explanations. They've been incredibly useful.
No, thank you so much, Doug. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for tasting the wines and for sharing this experience with us. We're really excited to be able to show the wines, and thank you so much to Benchmark Wine Group as well for the invitation.
Yeah, indeed. Well, a bit of housekeeping. I certainly wanted to let people know that the next Raid Your Cellar tasting is on December 3rd. And at that event, we'll be raising money for the United Sommeliers Foundation. So the hosts are Tanya Pitts and Philippe Andre, and it's Bring Your Favorite Champagne. So that cannot be painful. That could only be a great deal of fun. I certainly want to thank everybody for being here. Most and foremost, obviously, thank Benchmark. But Diana, this has been a really, really great experience for me. I am now, like everybody else, going, it's been too long. I need to be back in Spain. I need to be back in Vega Sicilia. This is driving me crazy. But someday soon, we will be allowed to go again. I know it seems a long ways away, but it will happen again. We really will get to live life again. I'm sure of that. So,
in the meantime, drink a lot of good wine.
Yeah, exactly that. So once again, thank you. I guess tomorrow promo codes will go out for all Vega Sicilia wines available on benchmarkwine.com. So you may want to, do a little planning so you make sure you get what you want first before somebody else does. And aside from that, it's wonderful to have a great Thursday evening tasting with you. Thank you so very kindly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Well, without further ado, have a wonderful evening, you all. Thanks.